I'm Kevin Bowman. I'm on the dev test team in charge of MQ and messaging. Can everyone see my screen? Lisa, it should be showing the dev test workstation.
Yes, we've got it.
All right, great. So I'm going to be showing some of the new MQ stuff that I've been working on. So we've had an MQ support for a long time, just like we've had JMS support for a long time. And recently, in the last couple of versions of dev test, I've rewritten JMS support from the ground up to be more stable, more maintainable, and have more features on it. And now I've done the same thing with IBM MQ. So I'm going to go through kind of a quick demo, starting from a blank project, kind of start to finish of doing tests in VSE with the new IBM MQ functionality. And then I'm going to go through it again and kind of cover some of the more advanced features. The first thing is, how do you like you mentioned, it's not enabled by default. So how do you enable it? So first you have to go to your Lisa home directory and look at local.properties, or create one if it's not there. And you're going to need an additional property in local.properties, lisa.experimental equals true. And the second thing you need to do in addition to that is you go to the add-ons directory under messaging, and there's a jar file, add-on IBM MQ Native.jar. It looks like an extension, but it's just enabling stuff that's already there inside the dev test release. So you take that jar file and you can copy it to hot deploy, and that'll enable the VSE protocol. Okay, so let's get started and talk about the new assets that were created for IBM MQ. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a queue manager, connection to a queue manager. I already know what the connection information needs to be. And before I save this, I can test it and make sure I can actually connect. Okay, and I saved it, and that's now saved in my config. So I now have a queue manager configuration saved in my config that I can use from test steps VSE. The next thing I'm going to do is add some queues. And under the same tree, it is native queue here. I'm going to add my request queue here. This is my regular live request queue. And I'm going to test this and make sure it works before I save. Okay. Now I'm going to real quick create 3 more, because I need, with VSE, I'm going to need total of 4 queues: the live request and response and the proxy request and response. Oops. Test that to make sure it works. Do the live response. Worked, and proxy response. Great. So all 4 of them work, and that's all my configuration is now done. I can just, when I'm going to the test step or the VSE recorder, I can just select these queues, and it'll have everything else, all the connection information, queue information configured for me. So let's show what that's like. I'm going to create a new test case. And under the IBM tree here, there's a new step, the IBM MQ native send receive. So if you're familiar with JMS, this should look almost exactly the same. There's a send side, and then the normal way that people familiar with MQ will call this is send as a put and receive as a get. So we try to follow the same nomenclature. So here I'm just going to, all I need to do is to put to my request queue and get from the response queue. Correlations, there are a couple of correlation schemes built in. There's the message ID to correlation ID, is pretty common, and then there's correlation ID and then payload correlation, which we'll get into later. Now I need to enter my, like any other messaging stuff, enter my request into the content section. And I already have my service running. It's just a command line service that's running on the live request and response queues. And tested in the step, and I got a response back. And that's it. That's once you have the configuration set up and configuring the actual test step, it's a matter of a couple of drop downs and entering your request. We reduced a lot of that fields that were there in the old MQ step just to drop down. So let's talk about the VSE recorder now. Well, I'm going to do an actual recording here. The transfer protocol will appear at the bottom because we added it like an extension. So it's called IBM MQ Native. And again, if you're familiar with JMS, this looks exactly the same. So you have your proxy request queue, your proxy response, your live request queue, and your live response. So I'm going to fill those in. And again, I can select a couple of pre-built correlation schemes. And I'm good to go. Now I'm recording. So I'm going to go back to my command line, and I have same way I have a command line service running on the live queues, I'm going to run a command line client, and I'm going to run it on the proxy queues. So here I'm just going to send a request right now, and I can see I got it. I got it on the service side, and it went through the recorder. So my message count increases both on the request and response sides. I'm going to send a few more through. Everything looks good. Everything is going through the service and the recorder. And that's it. I'm done recording. Like with any messaging protocol, you're going to need to use a data protocol to tell it how to pull arguments out of the message. I'm going to just do a very simple one here because it's a very simple service. And let's open up the service model in VSI. So if you look at the service image, the metadata should look familiar if you're familiar with the old MQ protocol. In fact, it's backwards compatible with service images that are generated from the old MQ protocol. Uses the same properties to control the message response that's sent. There are a couple of extra properties that I'll get into later when we go over some of the more advanced stuff. But for now, this should mostly just work out of the box. You can see the same deal on the request. Has the same properties that you've come to expect from the old MQ protocol. The thing that will look different is the service model, which now follows much more closely kind of a standard VSE model. You have just a listen step with no extra filters or assertions on it, a response step, and there's a live invocation step now. So live invocation is supported right out of the box now. So on the listen step, you can see the proxy request queue configured in the recorder. Our response step has the proxy response queue, and the live invocation step contains both the live request and the live response queue. This is what actually implements forwarding to the live service and receiving the response back all in one step. So real quickly, let's try deploying this. Show it to you in action. All right, our service is deployed, and I still have my client running on the proxy queues. So, and that's how the service is generated. It's listening on the proxy queue. So I'm going to just run it again. Or the client, the virtual service is running on the proxy queue. I'm going to run the client again. I can see I got a response back, but nothing hit my live service. But it did go through my virtual service. So it's virtualized. I'm going to take this and change it to live invocation mode. and do the same thing. Now it is hitting my live service, and it's also going through the virtual service. So that's kind of the real quick once through from start to finish of getting a test case and a virtual service created using the new MQ stuff. Now I'm going to go back through, unless there are any pressing questions on any of that stuff that I just talked about, and just that stuff, I can go over and look at some of the more advanced features that are present.
Kevin, there was one question in chat that was sent to me. What about client/stuff in the shell command prompt? That was the question.
If you're talking about this was just me running just a command line client application, and I'm running it against. This is a command line argument that tells it to run against the proxy queues as opposed to the live queues. It's
Omar,
just a client application.
Omar, if that answers your question, please. Oh, he wants to get a copy of that. That's what he's looking for.
Oh, okay, yes. So that is already there are some places that you can download that from. It's on the old ITKO Confluence, but if people want that, I can send out some links after this presentation.
Yeah, let's set out some links, and maybe we can enable our customer validation team, or rather the customers that are on this team, to have access to it as well. So I'll chat with you on that.
I have a Confluence page. Getting started with the MQ step and the VSE recorder that includes a demo application. So
oh, great.
If there's a place I can put, if there's a place I need to move it to the regular CA wiki, then I can do that, or we can just send out this link.
Yeah, the customer validation testers and our team on the call won't have access to Confluence, so we will duplicate that out on our community.
All right, that's great. We can take care of that later. Good question. So let's go back.
The other question is, I'm sorry, well, the other question that came in is, what is the best way to configure more than one MQ server? And team, if you have a question, can you please just select send to everyone so that Kevin can see these questions as well? So the question again was, what is the best way to configure more than one MQ server?
It's pretty easy. Just add a second one. Well, in fact, I think I have connection information for a second one here too. So I have a second MQ server, and if I want to have some queues created on that, I'm going to create a new native queue and make sure. So when I create a queue, now I have two selections here for the queue manager that it's on. I'm going to select the second one. Of course, I can play this, but I don't think that queue manager is actually up. But yeah, you can have as many queue managers and queues on queue managers as you want. It might be a little tough right now to tell them apart, like which queue is on which one. You might want to come up with some kind of naming scheme. So to tell them apart, but they're treated they're all interchangeable. In fact, you can have. If you can go to the VSE recorder, and you can have like your proxy queues on one queue manager and your live queues on a queue managers, or we could have 4 completely different queue managers involved. It doesn't matter to dev test. They're all treated the same.
What's great is that it just automatically populates the dropdown once you create that asset. So there's, again, if you have a good naming scheme, you'll be able to enable more than just the expert to use this technology now.
Exactly.
A few more questions are in the queue. Let's answer 2 more, and then we'll get moving on the the rest of the demo. Neil's asking, is it possible to have multiple MQs deployed on a single virtual service?
So what do you mean by multiple MQs?
So,
multiple.
Yeah, Neil, if you can unmute your line, it starts at, okay, he says multiple request response queues.
Yep, absolutely. That's actually something I was going to show but forgot. So you can put in multiple request queues, multiple response queues. It gets a little full, but you can put as many as you want in here. So you can have request queue 1, request queue 2, request queue 3, response queue 1, 2, 3. Each response you can have a different correlation scheme if you want. So sky's the limit.
Great. And then the other question, will Jindy be supported?
So Jindy is not MQ native. That's MQ JMS. So JNDI is a JMS technology. It's not an MQ native technology. So that's an important distinction. This is, I tried to make sure everything was named IBM MQ Native. So this is just native mode. If you want to use JMS, then we already support MQ with JMS. There's a JMS send receive. You can create a JMS queue. You create a queue connection with IBM MQ. So this is how you do JMS mode with IBM MQ. It's completely separate separate assets, and it's a separate recorder. So you would just use the regular JMS recorder for that. They're two completely different and incompatible, for the most part, messaging protocols. So that's why they're kept separate with the new updates.
All right, Kevin, thanks. This looks good, and I think we're ready to move to the next step. No more questions are coming in.
Okay, good questions. So I'm going to kind of go back over the script that I followed earlier and just kind of show some of the more advanced features on each of these. So every queue manager has a queue manager connection needs a name, but you also have other sort of connection properties here, and you can add a few more if you want. But if you enable Pro mode, the more advanced options show up, and there are a lot of them. So, and a lot of them are really just esoteric. We try to document stuff with tooltips as much as we can. But basically, if it's possible to configure it on a queue manager connection, then it appears here. So you don't, for 99% of the time, you won't have to worry about this. But if you do, then you can control every aspect of how we open this connection. And that's kind of the theme that's followed through for the rest of this. So if you look at a queue, and it also has some of the more advanced options like these open options, which is like, unless you're already familiar with what this does, the tooltips might not help you. Like there's some serious tooltips on some of these. But if you are a real MQ power user, then you have control of everything that DevTest is doing. Another thing that shows up here under advanced mode is the scope. And if you're familiar with JMS, and you should already know what this means, basically it controls how connection sharing operates. So if I have it set to step and it'll open a connection to this queue during a steps execution in either a virtual service model or a test case, and once that step is done, it'll close it. But if I have it set to model, then that connection to that queue will stay open and will be reused for the duration of that virtual service thread or the test case virtual user. And if I have it set to stage, then like if I stage a virtual service with a capacity of 10 or a test case with 10 virtual users, then all 10 of those will use the same connection to that queue. And finally, there's global, which is if I have something set to global, then everything in the virtual service in the VSE server or in the simulator that opens a connection to that queue, they'll all get the same connection. So that's how sharing is now handled with if you're in the same way with the JMS update. It works the same way with MQ. Now there are some things with MQ that don't work when you share. For example, if I have a get operation running on a queue manager connection, then basically that blocks anything else from running on that queue manager connection until that get operation is done. So we try to follow as best we can the scope that you set here. But if we run into a situation where it's far better to just open a new connection, if you have two simultaneous gets on the same queue, then we'll go ahead and open a new connection for that just to keep things running smoothly. So it really is more of a guideline than anything else, but we try to follow the scope that you set as much as we can. But there are complications and down under the covers with the MQ client. So that's the asset. So if we take a look at the test case in a little more detail. So now if I enable advanced mode on this, see a lot more options show up. Most of these should look familiar. Reply to, most people are familiar with what that means. Put options. There's a so it's again some more esoteric options that power users might be familiar with, but we expose everything if you want to change stuff up. So it gets ridiculously deep down into this, but if you need to have total control, then you have that option now. Again, there's a scope field here. There's one on both the put side and the get side. This is the way this interacts with the same scope field that's on the assets themselves is basically the larger scope takes precedence. So if your asset is set to step, but when you set your put operation to stage, then that'll mean all your queue and queue manager connections will be shared at the staged scope. So it'll be shared among all your VUs or all your capacity. The message that you send, you have control over all the header properties, and there are a lot of them. You see some of them are actually hexadecimal. So it gives you a lot of control if you need it. But again, it's not really for the novice user of MQ. Receive side, again, you have options you can set. Match options is basically the MQ equivalent of message selectors with JMS. It's a way to filter incoming messages. And if you have a correlation scheme, one of the built-in correlation schemes selected, then it should take care of that stuff for you. But it's there if you need it. Timeout is self-explanatory. If we don't receive a message within the timeout, then we'll error out. Poll interval, however, is interesting. So the way that MQ works is we have to make a get call to receive a message, and that will block for some amount of time. We can't interrupt it. We can't do anything with that connection while it's going. So the poll interval basically controls how long that get operation runs before we end it and check to see if something like the test case has been canceled or ended, or something else someone's tried to stop the virtual service. So basically, the end result of this is that determines the maximum amount of time that it can take for you to stop a service. So if you need more responsiveness and how quickly you can stop a service, you can set that to something smaller. But it means your service is going to poll MQ more frequently. So there's a trade-off there that we give you access to control if you need to. And don't try and set this to something large like 30 or 5 minutes, because that means it can take up to that amount of time for you to stop your service or stop your test case if it's not currently processing messages, it's waiting. So that's why we made that exposed to give you more control over that. There's more options there that are for more advanced users. But for the most part, you shouldn't have to worry about most of this stuff 99% of the time. Correlation schemes, I can show you the payload correlation scheme. So this is something that rather than using like a correlation ID or a message ID, it pulls a correlation identifier directly out of the payload itself. So this is something that we already had for JMS, and it's the same thing here. Looks like I already have this set up, so I can actually run this now. So I'm going to use this this part of my request as the correlation ID. It appears both in the request and the response. So I have my XPath set up. You can use XPath to pull a request out. You can also use regular expressions, or you can build your own. It's a pretty simple interface you can implement to implement your own payload scheme to pull something out of a request and response payload. So this should just work, I think. Yep, got my response back. So the last thing you can do in this editor is you can play around with the payload itself. So down here in the content window, you're usually familiar with entering a payload in here. And with MQ, the way the messages work, it can either be text or binary. But with this update, I've actually added another type of payload in here, and that's RFH2 header. So now you can directly edit. You can directly create and edit an RFH2 header, including all of the strange properties you can set. You can even have custom properties in here under what they're called folders. So if you're dealing with an application that directly uses RFH2, then now you have a few more options here. And there's also some options that are pretty good for debugging. So if I have this entered here and I can switch back to the binary payload, it'll actually show me what the binary value of that RFH2 header I just entered is. Another thing that's interesting to do is to load up. If you have an exported, like I previously exported a complicated RFH2 header in binary mode, and I can switch back to RFH2 mode and actually parse it out for me. So I can see the headers that are in there and various properties are there. This actually comes from, it's actually showing you a lot about how MQ implements JMS mode, because it implements JMS using RFH2 headers. You can see the properties that it's using in there. This doesn't mean that you should try and do JMS mode with the native mode send receive step. At least not without great difficulty, because we had to worry about things like filling these properties out. But it's good for debugging. And we also have support for doing something similar to this in BSE, where it'll actually pull out the inner payload rather than showing you the nasty RFH2 binary crap inside the BSE payload itself, and it does that automatically. So speaking of the BSE recorder, let me show the advanced features of that. So if you're familiar with the JMS recorder, then almost all of this should look familiar. It has options for recording, number of recording threads, things for controlling multiple responses, that kind of stuff. One thing that's been added in 8.0, this has actually been added for both JMS and with the new MQ stuff, is this Dsm type. So this brings back the old generate with proxy queues, generate with live queues selection that was in the old JMS and MQ recorders. So by default, it'll generate, like we saw with the VSM. The listen step will be on the proxy queue, and then there'll be a live invocation step going to the live queues. But if you want to generate so that it's listening on the live queues, then you have the option of doing that. But when you do that, listen step will be on the live queues, response step will be in the live response queue, but there will be no live invocation step. So that means you can select this to have it on the live queues, and basically assuming that you're going to turn your live service off. So mentioned channel names. Actually, I haven't mentioned channel names. So this is how so when you have multiple requests and responses, each one has a different channel name. The channel name has to be unique. And this is how kind of the interaction with the service image and the DSM goes. So if your service image, you can see this. I mentioned back in the response metadata, this channel name. So this channel name here in the response metadata has to match the channel name in your response step. But other than that, all of this connection information that's in the response metadata is basically just there for informational historical purposes. Because all the connection information is used from the response step. So if I want to change my proxy response queue on the fly without regenerating my service image, then I can do that here in the service model, and all that matters is that my channel name on my response metadata matches the channel name on the request. It's the same way on the request side, where I have a channel name that should match the channel name on the request metadata. And also, by default, the operation name is now the request channel name as opposed to the request queue name, which can also be overridden by a data protocol if you want. So one final thing on the VSC recorder. So a feature that I added in for JMS, but really it was for MQ. You notice here on the request and response that I can edit things like match intervals, convert options, that kind of stuff. Well, I still have as much control over the get and put operations here on the recorder as I did on the test step. But on the response side, there's an additional property here, another reply to option. And this is for things that happen when some customers have MQs set up to have remote queues and weird forwarding setups where the reply to that they send in their request is not the actual queue we need to use to respond to from our recorder. I've seen it so many times, and we added some kludges in for the old MQ protocol, and here it is again in the new one. So if the client sends this is the proxy response, and if the client uses if the client sends this as their response queue, but they sends this as their reply to queue, but they actually need to respond to a different response queue. Actually, I'm already confused. I got that backwards. So this is a queue that we're actually going to respond to, but this is a queue that the client sends us as a reply to. So if it's going to be something different, then we can put that in here, and that allows us to match things up with what channels we should use a lot easier. It's a lot easier to describe that with a diagram, but we'll move on from there. It's also the same thing on the service side. So if we have to send a reply to that's different from the one in the service, we actually listen to the response from, and this allows us to change that here. And you can see the same settings on the Dsm. So the listen step has, or the response step, Pro mode has where's this on the live invocation step? Yeah, the live invocation step is going to have reply to mappings on there. And the listen step, there it is. Has that automatically set up for you. I think that's all that I wanted to show as far as the advanced stuff. I know I went through a lot of that very quickly, but we're recording this, so I hope you can go back and watch it again if you need to. Do we have any questions?
So guys, if you have questions, bottom right of this screen is the chat window. If not, or if you'd like to verbally ask a question, you could use the *6 to unmute your line on your phone, and we'd be happy to take verbal questions as well. Or rather, Kevin would be happy to take verbal questions. Good question from Neil in regards to when this version is planned for official release. They can't deploy this company-wide until it's officially released. And understood, Neil, the reason why we are having this call today is really to get feedback from the community and the customer validation group, and also to finish up our documentation that may be necessary for the feature before it gets released. I don't have an actual date yet, but I believe this is the next feature to be released publicly. So when I do have a date, we'll be adding information to that thread. I would hope it's within the next month or two. That was my product manager response to your question, Neil, and I do understand you're looking for a more concrete date, and I will do my best to get you a more concrete date once I see that all the documentation is done and we've gotten feedback from customers. So let us know what you don't like about this. Let us know what you do like, and that'll help move this along a little bit further. I think one of our biggest things as part of our agile development cycle is we want to make sure that before we release something into the wild, if you would, that our customers have reviewed it and that they understand it and that it achieves what they need us to achieve. Any other questions on the phone? Well, guys, I would hope that as a result of this call, you now have access to this functionality in 8.02 that you can download. I'm going to give you some links over in the chat window. The first one is the link to the 8.02 release blog that'll give you all the information on how to download 8.02. It does not share that this hidden feature is there. Okay, that's the first link. That's how you get 8.02. The second link I'm going to put in the chat window is something I already put there. It's a specific blog about this hidden feature. And this is where you can ask Kevin questions about the feature or give us feedback after the call ends. So if you can take a look at that link, that is under secure login, so you'll have to log into our community to get access to that link. Now, if you don't have access to the link, please send me a note after the call and we'll make sure that that access is granted. Kevin, do you have anything else that you'd like to add here, or do you want us to wrap up?
I'm going to show one more thing when we have time.
Okay.
I'm going to show the RFH2 stuff being used in VSE. I just changed my service in my client application so that they use RFH2 as opposed to just plain XML. And I ran them through Recorder with exactly the same configuration as I did before. I'm going to do the same. Even though it's RFH2, it's already pulled out the inner payload, which is still XML. So I still should be able to see the inner payload and pull out arguments for that. Let's take a look at the service image. And I can see now that I have some more properties in there, including this payload class, which you may have noticed before, which now has a meaning because it's now telling me that it's being sent at RFH, and here's it's RFH2, and here's some additional properties that are used to configure that RFH2 header that's wrapping the actual body, which is still extracted out as XML. So that kind of shows you RFH2 being handled automatically. It's almost like a data protocol handler, but it's built into the protocol as opposed to being separate.